The dust of the Arizona Territory settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the soul as much as it did the wagon wheels. Jedediah Stone felt it in his throat, a constant grit that no amount of water could wash away. He pulled the weary horse to a stop in the center of what passed for a main street in Redemption Gulch. The town looked tired, bleached by a sun that offered no mercy. Wooden storefronts sagged, their signs faded into illegible whispers. From the double doors of the Gilded Cage Saloon, the tinny sound of a piano and raucous laughter spilled out, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the street. Beside him, Alara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. A simple bonnet shaded her face, but Jed didn't need to see her eyes to know she was taking everything in. She saw more in her silence than most men did with all their blustering talk. That's what they didn't understand. He reached over and gently squeezed her hand. She squeezed back, a small, firm gesture that said everything he needed to hear. "Just need to get some supplies, Alara, then we'll head out to the plot. Won't take long," he murmured, his voice low and raspy from the trail. He tied the horse to the hitching post, his movements slow and deliberate. As he helped Alara down from the wagon, the piano music from the saloon faltered. A few faces appeared in the windows, eyes narrowed with suspicion. A new wagon was an event, a new couple, an even bigger one. Jed ignored them, his focus solely on his wife. "You wait here, or you want to come in. A cool drink might do you good." Alara looked at the saloon, then back at him. She gave a single, decisive nod and gestured toward the swinging doors. She was not a woman who hid. Jed's heart swelled with a familiar mix of pride and fierce protectiveness. He took her arm and pushed through the doors. The noise inside died instantly. Smoke hung in the air, thick and stale. The room was filled with ranchers, prospectors, and men with no clear purpose other than to drink away the day. Every eye turned to them. To him, a stranger, and to her, the silent woman at his side. The bartender, a thick man with a stained apron, wiped a glass, his movements slowing as he watched them. Jed led Alara to a small, secluded table in the corner, away from the main cluster of men at the bar. He pulled out her chair before sitting opposite her. The whispers started immediately, a low, venomous hum. "Who's he? Never seen him before. Look at her. Pretty thing, but quiet. Too quiet, you ask me." A loud, braying laugh cut through the murmurs. A burly rancher named Silas, his face flushed with whiskey, swaggered over to their table. "Well now, stranger, don't you believe in introductions? And what about your lady friend? Cat got her tongue?" Jed looked up slowly, his gaze level and cold. "The name's Jed. This is my wife, Alara." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "She doesn't speak, but she hears just fine." Silas snorted, unimpressed. "A wife who don't talk? Some men would call that a blessing. Me, I think it's just plain strange. What's wrong with her, cowboy? She's simple." Before Jed could rise, a smooth, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Silas. The man's just come into town. Let him have his drink in peace." Sheriff Brody Thorne emerged from the shadows of the bar, a star pinned to his vest, his smile wide and disarming. He was handsome in a predatory way, his eyes missing the warmth of his smile. He tipped his hat. "Apologies for my constituents, friend. They get a little rough around the edges. Welcome to Redemption Gulch." He glanced at Alara, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "A pleasure, ma'am." Alara's reaction was small, almost invisible. Her hands, which had been resting on the table, clenched into tight fists in her lap. Her gaze, which had been downcast, lifted to meet the sheriff's. For a split second, Jed saw something flash in her eyes, not fear, but a cold, hard recognition. A flicker of ancient hatred. The sheriff's smile faltered, as if he felt a chill. Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. Alara looked away, her composure absolute once more. Sheriff Thorne cleared his throat, turning his attention back to Jed. "You and the missus setting up nearby?" "Bought the old Miller place, east of here," Jed said, his voice tight. "Ah," the sheriff nodded, a look of pity crossing his features. "Brave man, and braver still," he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he leaned in. To take on a damaged wife. A man needs a woman who can call for help, if you take my meaning. The insult, cloaked in concern, was worse than Silas's drunken mockery. The room waited, breathless. Jed stood up, his chair scraping against the floorboards. He placed a few coins on the table. "We'll be going," he said, his voice dangerously low. He helped Alara to her feet, his arm a solid presence around her. As they walked toward the door, Silas let out another laugh. "Runnin' away. Can't handle a little fun, cowboy? Guess you're used to silence." The laughter followed them out into the searing sun, loud and cruel. Jed felt a tremor run through Alara's arm, but it wasn't a shiver of fear. It was the rigid hum of coiled steel. The ride back to their homestead was a silent one, but it was a comfortable silence. A world away from the suffocating quiet Alara had been forced to endure in the saloon. The prairie stretched out around them, a vast canvas of muted browns and golds under a sky so wide it seemed to press down on the horizon. Here, the only sounds were the creak of saddle leather, the steady plod of their horses, and the lonely whistle of the wind through the tall, dry grass. This was their sanctuary. The cabin Jedediah had secured was modest, little more than a single room with a stone hearth and 2 small windows, but it was sturdy. It stood alone, a stubborn little outpost against the vast emptiness of the plains. While Jed saw to the horses, Alara stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of pine wood and clean earth. It was a blank slate, a place where the jeers of Redemption Gulch couldn't reach them. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Jed worked from sunup to sundown, mending the corral fence, clearing stubborn rocks from the patch of land he hoped to turn into a garden, his movements steady and purposeful. He never pressed Alara for details about her reaction to the sheriff. He simply provided a shield with his presence, a quiet strength that told her she was safe. Alara, in turn, transformed the bare cabin into a home. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, patched a drafty spot in the wall with mud and straw, and arranged their few belongings with care. She cooked their meals over the open hearth, simple stews and cornbread that tasted like heaven after a long day's labor. They communicated with a language all their own, a shared look across the dinner table, a gentle touch of her hand on his arm, a small, soft smile that he returned with a warmth that reached his eyes. He saw not a broken woman, but a resilient one, a spirit as vast and untamed as the land around them. One evening, after Jed had fallen into an exhausted sleep, a sliver of moon cast a pale light through the window. The cabin was still, save for the crackle of the dying embers in the hearth. Alara rose from their shared cot, her movements as silent as a shadow. She knelt before her small, personal trunk in the corner of the room. Her fingers traced the worn leather straps before unbuckling them. Inside, beneath a folded wool shawl and a few pressed flowers, was a small, polished mahogany box. It was a beautiful thing, its surface smooth and dark, clearly cherished. With a delicate touch, she lifted the lid. The box was not filled with jewelry or sentimental keepsakes. Instead, nestled in faded velvet lining, lay the tools of a scribe, a slender goose feather quill, a sealed bottle of black ink, and a stack of crisp, cream-colored paper. These were not the possessions of a simple homesteader's wife. They were the instruments of an educated, articulate woman. She carried the box to the small wooden table, her heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against her ribs. The face of Sheriff Brody Thorne swam in her memory, the charming smile that didn't reach his eyes, the casual cruelty in his voice. The flash of recognition in the saloon hadn't been a mistake. It had been the collision of a carefully buried past with a brutal present. Her hands, usually so gentle as she tended their home, were now firm with purpose. She uncorked the ink, the faint, sharp smell filling the small space. She dipped the tip of the quill, watching as the black liquid clung to it, a single, perfect drop trembling at the point. The laughter from the saloon echoed in her mind, not as an insult, but as a catalyst. They thought her silence was a weakness. They were about to learn it was her shield. With a deep, steadying breath, Alara lowered the quill to the first sheet of paper. The scratch of the nib was the only sound in the vast, sleeping wilderness. And under the flickering lamplight, she began to write. The only sounds in the small cabin were the gentle crackle of the embers in the hearth and the insistent scratching of Alara's quill against the thick paper. Lamplight cast a warm, flickering halo around her, illuminating the intense focus etched onto her features. Her hand moved with a fluid certainty that belied the turmoil churning within her. The ink flowed, dark and permanent, forming words that had been silenced for years. She wasn't just writing, she was excavating. Each stroke of the pen was a shovel digging into the compacted earth of her memory, unearthing a story she had tried to bury. Fragments appeared on the page, stark and accusing. Brody Thorne. He called himself a lawman even then in Silver Creek. The night of the fire, October 14th, 1876. He smelled of whiskey and smoke, smiling as the flames consumed everything. My father's ledger. He saw it. He knew what it contained. He promised protection, but delivered only betrayal. A floorboard creaked in the other room. Alara froze, her heart seizing in her chest. The quill hovered over the page, a single drop of ink swelling at its tip before falling like a black tear. Slowly, she turned her head. Jedediah stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim moonlight filtering through the main room's window. His hair was tousled from sleep, his face shadowed, but his eyes were fixed on the papers spread across the small table. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence, once their shared comfort, was now stretched taut with a new, unspoken tension. Alara's first instinct was to shield the pages, to hide the truth she had so carefully guarded. But his gaze held no anger, no accusation. Only a deep, questioning stillness. He took a slow step into the room, his movements gentle, as if not to startle a fawn. His eyes flickered from her face to the ink-stained papers, then back again. He had seen enough. He didn't need to read every word to understand the gravity of her secret. The name, Thorne, was enough. Alara watched him, her breath caught in her throat. This was the moment that could change everything. Would he see her deception? A woman who was not as helpless as she appeared. A wife who had brought a dangerous past into their quiet life. Jed came to a stop beside the table. He didn't reach for the papers. Instead, he looked directly at her, his expression softening with a profound, aching concern. He raised a hand, not to take the quill, but to gently touch her cheek. His calloused thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. In that single touch, she felt no judgment, only a question. Are you all right? She gave a slight, trembling shake of her head. Her eyes darted to the page where Thorne's name was written, a clear and damning indictment. Jed's gaze followed hers. He leaned over slightly, his eyes scanning the last few lines she'd written. He saw the words fire and betrayal. He saw the date. He didn't press her, didn't demand an explanation. He simply absorbed the fragmented truth, his jaw tightening. The unsettling feeling he'd had in the saloon coalesced into a cold certainty. The sheriff wasn't just a bully. He was a monster from his wife's past. Straightening up, Jed looked around their small, peaceful home, seeing it now not just as a sanctuary, but as a fortress, one whose walls suddenly felt perilously thin. He then looked back at Alara, whose hand still rested on her written testimony. He reached down and gently placed his large, warm hand over hers, covering both her fingers and the damning words beneath them. It was a gesture of solidarity, a silent vow. Your fight is my fight. Alara's shoulders, which had been tense with fear, finally relaxed. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. He knew. And he did not turn away. He stood with her. The secret was no longer hers alone to carry. It was theirs, a shared burden and a shared purpose. In the quiet lamplight, surrounded by the ghosts of a fiery past, their silent partnership was forged into an unbreakable alliance. The following dawn was different. The pale light that spilled into the small cabin no longer felt like a gentle promise of a new day, but a sliver of exposure in their now fragile sanctuary. The air was thick with the unsaid, a blend of shared purpose and palpable danger. Jed was already awake, sitting in his chair, watching Alara at the table. She hadn't slept. The quill was once again in her hand, the soft, rhythmic scratching the only sound besides the crackle of the hearth. He rose and moved to the stove, the familiar routine of making coffee a steadying anchor in the shifting currents of their lives. He poured 2 cups, placing one beside her without a word, his gesture a simple offering of fuel and fortitude. Her hand paused its frantic movement for just a moment, her eyes lifting to meet his. In them, he saw not the frightened woman from the saloon, but a determined chronicler of injustice. He glanced at the fresh pages. New names appeared: Marcus, a blacksmith. Words like false ledger, ambush, and livery fire were woven into the damning narrative of Sheriff Thorne's rise to power in Silver Creek, all built on the ashes of other men's lives. She was detailing how Thorne had coveted the blacksmith's land, how he'd orchestrated the fire that claimed 2 lives, and how he had masterfully framed the innocent Marcus, who was hanged based on Thorne's chillingly persuasive testimony. Ilara, then just a girl working in the stables, had seen Thorne start the blaze from the shadows of the hayloft. Their eyes had met for a fleeting second in the firelight, a moment of shared, terrible knowledge that had sent her fleeing for her life. Jed knew they couldn't simply hide. Her testimony was a weapon, but a weapon was useless without a target and a plan. He walked to the corner where his saddlebags lay and slung them over his shoulder. He looked at Ilara, his gaze steady. He pointed toward the door, then tapped his ear, his expression serious. "I'll go to town. I'll listen." Her writing stopped. Fear, cold and sharp, flashed in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a resolute trust. She gave him a single, firm nod. She understood. He was her ears, just as she was their voice on the page. The ride into Redemption Gulch felt different, too. The dusty Main Street Jed had seen as merely unwelcoming now seemed predatory. Every shuttered window looked like a watching eye. He saw Deputy Miller leaning against a veranda post, his thumb hooked in his gun belt, his gaze sweeping over the street with an air of proprietary menace. Jed dismounted in front of the general store, giving the deputy a slow, deliberate nod before pushing through the door. The bell chimed softly. The store smelled of milled flour, leather, and pipe tobacco. Silas Croft, the proprietor, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. "Morning, Jedediah," he said, his tone as dry as the dust outside. "Silas," Jed acknowledged, walking to the counter. "Need some flour, coffee, and a box of cartridges." As Silas began measuring out the goods, Jed leaned against the worn wooden counter, affecting a casual air. "Town's been mighty quiet lately." Silas grunted, not looking up. "Sheriff Thorne ensures it stays that way." Jed pressed gently, his voice low. "He runs a tight ship. Man has a firm grip on things." Silas stopped, his scoop hovering over the sack of flour. He slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting Jed's over the rim of his glasses. The shopkeeper's gaze held a deep, weary caution. He glanced toward the street, ensuring the deputy was out of earshot, before leaning forward slightly. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Peace has a price, son. In Redemption Gulch, that price is silence. You do well to remember that." He said nothing more. The weight of his words hung in the air, a stark confirmation of Ilara's story. This wasn't just one corrupt man. It was an entire town, held hostage by fear. Jed paid for his supplies, his mind racing. As he turned to leave, the bell chimed again and Deputy Miller filled the doorway, his shadow falling long across the floorboards. The deputy's eyes locked onto Jed's for a beat too long, a silent, chilling question in his stare. Jed held his gaze, offered another non-committal nod, and walked out into the harsh sunlight, the feeling of being watched prickling his skin all the way back to the homestead. He returned to find Ilara standing on the porch, waiting. He dismounted, and in the quiet of the evening, he didn't need to say a word. She saw the grim confirmation in his eyes. He had found no allies, but he had found the truth. Their fight was not just for her past, but for the town's future. The conversation with Silas Croft had coiled a new tension in the air at the homestead. The silence that was once their comfort now felt like a stretched wire, humming with unspoken danger. Jedediah spent the next day reinforcing the latch on their cabin door and cleaning his rifle with a meticulousness that was both calming and unnerving. He worked with his back to the open plains, but his senses were tuned to the horizon, listening for the telltale sound of approaching horses. Inside, Alara wrote with a feverish intensity. The ink bled onto the page, forming words that were not just memories, but accusations. The act of writing was an act of defiance, each stroke of the quill a small rebellion against the man who had stolen her voice. She was no longer just documenting the past. She was building a case, brick by painstaking brick. Her world had shrunk to the tip of her pen and the growing stack of paper she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The sound Jed had been waiting for came in the late afternoon. It wasn't the gallop of a posse, but the slow, deliberate plod of a single horse. He straightened up from the woodpile, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his body a study in feigned relaxation. A lone rider crested the low hill, Deputy Hank, his silver star glinting in the harsh sunlight. He rode not like a man with urgent business, but like one who had all the time in the world, his presence a clear and deliberate message. Jed met him a good distance from the cabin. "Afternoon, Deputy," he said, his voice even. "Something I can help you with?" Hank swung down from his horse, a lazy smile that didn't reach his eyes playing on his lips. "Just a friendly visit, Stone. Sheriff Thorne likes to keep tabs on folks in his county, especially those who choose to live so far out. Can get lonely." The implication was clear. It could also get dangerous. Inside, Alara had heard the voices. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. With swift, silent movements, she gathered her pages, slid them into their oilcloth wrapping, and secured them back in their hiding place, pulling the bearskin rug over the spot just as the deputy's shadow fell across the doorway. "The wife and I, we prefer the quiet," Jed replied, not taking his eyes off the deputy. He stood his ground, a physical barrier between the lawman and his home. "I'm sure you do," Hank drawled, his gaze sweeping over the homestead, lingering on the cabin. "Heard you were in town yesterday, asking questions at Croft's store. A man gets curious, is all. Wanted to make sure you folks are settling in proper, that you have everything you need." The threat was thinly veiled. "We are watching you." "We have all we need," Jed said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My wife is resting. It was a long journey here." Hank nodded slowly, chewing on a piece of straw. "Right, the quiet one." He spat near Jed's boot. "Well, you tell her the sheriff sends his regards." He mounted his horse, gave the cabin one last look, and rode off at the same unhurried pace. Jed waited until Hank was a small speck in the distance before he went back inside. The air in the cabin was thick with what they couldn't say. Alara met his gaze, her eyes wide with fear, but also burning with a fierce, new resolve. The visit hadn't broken them, it had ignited a fuse. She moved to the floorboard, her hands trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. She retrieved her pages and quill, her mind racing. The deputy's visit, the reminder of Thorne's reach, had shaken loose a piece of memory she had buried deep. It was a face in the smoke-filled chaos of the Silver Creek fire, a face she thought she'd imagined. A stable boy, young and terrified, scrambling away from the burning livery, his eyes wide with the same horror that had paralyzed her. She dipped her quill, her hand flying across a fresh sheet of paper. Her writing was no longer neat, but a frantic scrawl. She underlined the name twice, pressing so hard the nib tore the paper. She held it up for Jed to see. It wasn't just a confession anymore. It was a lead. His name was Finn. He worked at the stables. I saw him escape. Thorne thinks he is dead. The name hung in the air between them, a flickering candle in a vast, dark room. Finn. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like Redemption Gulch. But for the first time since laying eyes on Brody Thorne, Alara felt its warmth. Jedediah saw it in the frantic energy of her hands, the way her eyes, usually clouded with a deep-seated sorrow, now held a spark of desperate light. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers on the slate. "The stable boy? Alara, they said everyone perished in the livery fire." She shook her head, pulling her hand away to write again, the chalk scratching urgently. He was small, scared. He saw Thorn set the first blaze. When the roof beams cracked, he hid in the hayloft. I saw him run, east, into the woods, away from the town. The implications settled over Jed like a heavy winter coat. Finn wasn't just a witness, he was the only other witness. A living, breathing confirmation of everything Alara was risking her life to expose. But if he was alive, he was also a loose thread Thorn would not hesitate to snip. He has to be found, Jed said, his voice low and firm, the words a vow. And it has to be now, before Thorn gets any wiser. Their quiet homestead transformed into a staging ground for a covert mission. Over a faded map of the territory spread across their small wooden table, Alara traced a path with her finger from Redemption Gulch back towards the skeletal remains of Silver Creek. It was a 2-day ride, through unforgiving terrain that offered little cover. While Jed packed a saddlebag with jerky, hardtack, and a spare canteen, Alara prepared the homestead for his absence. She stacked firewood by the door, checked the water barrel, and took inventory of their meager supplies. The most important preparation came last. Jed took the heavy Winchester rifle from its pegs above the mantelpiece. He worked the lever, the metallic shick-shack echoing in the tense silence. He didn't need to explain its use. Alara had learned to shoot long ago, a grim necessity for a woman on the frontier. But he looked her in the eyes, his expression grave. "Don't be shy with it," he said. "Don't wait to see the whites of their eyes. If someone you don't know rides up, you make it clear this is our land. One warning shot, if they don't heed it, you don't miss." She nodded, her jaw set. She took the rifle from him, its weight familiar and chilling. There was no tearful goodbye at dawn, no lingering embrace. Their bond was forged in silent understanding. As the first pale light of morning washed over the prairie, Jed mounted his horse. He looked down at Alara, standing on the porch, a small, resolute figure clutching a rifle that was almost as tall as she was. He gave a single, sharp nod. She returned it. It was all that needed to be said. He turned his horse east and rode, not looking back, the silhouette of him and his mount shrinking against the rising sun. The silence Jed left behind was heavier than any she had ever known. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every creak of the cabins would like a footstep on the porch. She spent the day in a state of heightened alert, moving from her writing table to the window, then to the door, peering out at the vast, empty landscape. She was a lighthouse keeper on an ocean of dry grass, and every shadow was a potential ship of pirates. As dusk bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and bruised purple, a profound loneliness set in. For the first time, she felt the true weight of her isolation. Jed was her shield, her voice. Without him, she was just a mute woman on a lonely plot of land, a perfect victim. The thought hardened her resolve. She would not be a victim. She bolted the door, checked the rifle's chamber one last time, and sat by the unlit hearth, waiting for the long night to pass. The trail in Silver Creek was colder than the ash that coated Jedediah's boots. After hours of asking ghosts in a dead town, he found an old prospector who remembered a terrified stable boy fleeing into the foothills. Jed found him there, in a linta barely fit for a coyote. Finn was a man hollowed out by fear, his eyes wide and haunted. "Thorn will kill me," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Jedediah didn't argue. He simply pulled a folded page from his pocket, one of Alara's, her script steady and clear. "He's trying to kill my wife's spirit," Jed said, his voice low but firm. "She saw what you saw, and she's not running anymore." He laid the paper in Finn's trembling hands. The shared memory, a bond forged in fire and injustice, was stronger than Finn's fear. He looked up, a spark of resolve in his eyes. "For her," Finn agreed, his voice finding its strength. Back at the homestead, the afternoon sun cast long, menacing shadows. The silence was broken by the crunch of a horse's hooves. It was Sheriff Thorn, dismounting with a predatory slowness. He didn't bother to knock, pushing the cabin door open. Alara stood waiting, a cast-iron skillet in her hand, her stance unwavering. "All alone, little bird?" Thorn sneered, his eyes sweeping the small room. "Your man run off and leave you." He stepped closer, his bulk filling the space, suffocating it. "I hear you've been writing stories. Nasty little lies." He saw the inkwell and a few scattered papers on the table and swiped them to the floor. Alara didn't flinch. Her silence was not empty. It was a wall of defiance he could not breach. Enraged by her composure, he grabbed her arm. "We're going to town. The whole town is going to hear what a liar you are before I lock you up for good." He dragged her out of the cabin and forced her onto his horse, riding hard for Redemption Gulch. He shoved her through the doors of the Gilded Cage Saloon, the same place where her humiliation had begun. The room fell silent. "This woman," Thorn boomed, his voice echoing in the tense quiet, "has been trying to poison my name." He held her fast, a cruel smirk on his face, certain of his victory. Just then, the saloon doors swung open again, revealing Jedediah and a pale-faced Finn. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Thorn's smirk faltered. "Let her go, Thorn," Jedediah said, his voice ringing with authority. Ignoring him, Thorn laughed. "She has nothing, no proof, no voice." In that moment, Alara proved him wrong. With a sudden, sharp movement, she broke free from his loosened grip. She did not run to Jedediah. Instead, she walked with calm purpose to the center of the room. From a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her dress, she produced a thick, neatly bound collection of pages. She held it not like a weapon, but like a testament. She walked directly to Silas Croft, the general store owner, who stood frozen near the bar, and placed the manuscript in his hands. Her eyes met his, conveying a silent plea. Understanding dawned on Silas's face. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking at first, then growing stronger as he began to read aloud. The saloon was utterly still, the only sound his voice detailing the arson, the stolen gold, the framing of an innocent man, every crime laid bare in Alara's precise, damning script. When he read the final sentence, a heavy silence descended. Thorn's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. Then Finn stepped forward. "It's true," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Every word. I was there. I saw him lock the stable doors before he lit the fire." The spell of fear Thorn held over the town shattered. The patrons, once his jeering audience, now looked at him with contempt. Thorn, cornered and exposed, made a final, desperate move, drawing his pistol. But he was too slow. Jedediah was already moving, not with a gun, but with the raw speed of a man protecting his family. He slammed into Thorn, sending the gun clattering across the floorboards. Several townsmen surged forward, pinning the disgraced sheriff down before he could recover. Later, as a U.S. Marshal summoned by a discreet telegram from Silas led Thorn away in shackles, the town square was quiet. Jedediah stood beside Alara, his hand gently holding hers. The people of Redemption Gulch looked at her now, not with pity or mockery, but with a profound, humbled respect. Alara met their gazes, her head held high. She hadn't needed to speak a single word to be heard. Her silence had been her shield, her pen had been her sword, and together, they had brought justice to the Gulch.